The other day I was listening to a James Tullis video about dystopian futures, and he asked a rhetorical question that got me thinking in my own pedantic way. Why are all these books set in the US? I'm paraphrasing a bit. I gave myself the usual obvious answers, but as it often does, the lists of reasons kept piling up. So I decided to lay out my thoughts and list some of the reasons why so many books we read are set in the good old US of A. Also, this isn't meant to be an attack on Mr. Tullis. He's just the one that got me thinking, and he's not the first to ask this or a similar question. Mostly this is just going to be me ranting on the vague question a lot of people ask without really thinking about. But first, a bit of self-promotion, and this time for a different book. My book Hapless Homesteader is out, and I'm running a promotion on it this weekend. Bob Stackey, a freelance programmer, survived the apocalypse by doing the one thing he does best, being a shut-in. Now the power is out, everyone is dead, and he must somehow survive in the pristine ruins of the city he calls home. With no skills and no muscles, will luck be on the side of this hapless homesteader? I will leave a link to this book and my other works in the description. On with the video. So why are so many of the books we read set in the United States? Barring fantasy and sci-fi, of course. After racking my brain for a bit, then disposing of the flimsier reasons, I've come up with the following list of things to discuss on the topic: the English language, Hollywood, author locality, and xenophobia versus oikophobia. So let's start with the tamest of all the reasons, the English language. If you're watching this video, you're more than likely a native speaker of English. If you're not, I applaud you on learning the most difficult language on earth, made even more difficult by the fact that most native speakers don't speak it well. English is spoken natively by about 400 million people worldwide, and the United States has about 300 million of those native speakers. This means that roughly 3/4 of the native English-speaking world live in the United States. That in itself is a good reason why so many books written in English are set in the US. But what about the home of the language, England? They only have about 68 million English speakers, making them roughly 1/5 of the native English-speaking population. In fact, India has more people who speak English at 129 million, though not all of them natively. By this criterion alone, more books printed in English should be set in India than the birthplace of the language. Spanish and French have a similar problem, as both are spoken far more outside their countries of birth than inside. The US isn't just the largest native speakers of English, we're also the largest country where English is the dominant language. I'm sure my European listeners will be tired of hearing this, but the US is a monstrously large place. The United States is about 3.9 million square miles. For the French measurement inclined, that's almost 10 million square kilometers. In fact, you can fit almost every European nation in the US and still have space left over. Caveat, I said almost. This means there's a lot of places for stories to take place. Add to this that most Americans don't speak any other language. The reason for that is simple. We don't need to. From where I live, I can drive a day west, north, or south, and still the vast majority of people will speak English. If I drive a day east, I'll be talking to fish, and that's a different problem. Learning another language to fluency in the States is usually reserved for people who want to travel abroad, hobbyists, translators, or people just looking to act smug. Speaking of acting smug, let's move on to our next reason why so many books are set in the US: Hollywood. It may surprise many people that a city that generally says nothing but bad things about a nation is the major reason why so many books are set in that nation. Hollywood, like it or not, has a sizable market share when making movies in English. I'm having trouble finding appropriate, trustworthy numbers for Hollywood's exact market share of the English-speaking movies, but according to what I can find, Hollywood has about a 55% global market share on all films. So it's not a far stretch to say they dominate the English-speaking market. So why is this important to books? Well, Hollywood pulls a large amount of their movie ideas from books. They're having a bit of a hard time coming up with their own lately, at least any ideas that are profitable. Most of those books will be in English for the reasons stated above, and since almost every town, county, and municipality in the States will welcome a film studio shooting in the US, it's practical. Add to that fact that domination of the domestic box office is always a major goal of any film studio. Setting movies in the US is an easy way to relate to that audience. Since many authors want their books to be made into movies, naturally, they will do their best to be accommodating and relatable, and for Hollywood types, that means setting it in the US. Yes, I know there are exceptions, and you are welcome to list them in the comments. This brings us to our next point, and that is, many books are set in the US because the authors are located in the US. This may sound petty, but let's look at another major entertainment industry. If we ignore isekai, the bulk of manga and anime is set in Japan. This is because the vast majority of mangakas live and work in the country. Japanese is their first language, and writing about what you know is preferable to the alternative. We'll talk more about that point later. If you follow this logic, most books written in English will likely be set in the country with the most English speakers. This obviously excludes fantasy and science fiction not taking place on Earth. Since most people write about what they know, and most English authors live in the US, it's a given that most books will take place there because of what the author knows. You can blame writing about what you know for a lot of self-inserts. Industries that work together will gravitate towards similar standards. This is due to the age-old practice of making the sale as easy as possible. We see this with other industries too. If you're old like me, you'll remember Saturday morning cartoons and the cheap plastic toys they advertised to kids with the subtlety of a drug dealer entering a rundown apartment complex. The cartoons existed to pitch the associated toys and to sell commercial airtime. This also affected the ad agencies as they produced commercials not only geared towards kids, but set to the snappy length ads needed to be to fill the 9 minutes of available airtime in every 30-minute block. If only modern media companies stuck to just 1/3 of your time wasted with ads. It's no secret that movies and television have affected the way books are written. If you've read books from before television was widely adopted, you'll notice they're usually more descriptive, have a different, often more ponderous tone, and are generally better written, at least as far as dictation goes. But trust me, a lot of this is just standing the test of time. There are a lot of poorly written books from over 100 years ago, some of which have grammar and editing that will curl your teeth. It's also sad to acknowledge that things like TikTok are having an effect on modern literature. I should know. Regardless of how much you may like a hobby, craft, or skill, most people want to be monetarily successful at it. Receiving money and awards for the things you do is almost a universal want, and making a living at something you enjoy is a major desire in the modern world. Or really any time, if we're being honest. But there is something more I want to touch on with this rant. People write about what they know, and that's how it should be. We generally despise people who try to talk about things they don't know enough about. When I grew up, this was called being a poser. I think now it's called being a tourist. You don't have to look far to find examples of this. Depending upon what you're wrong about, ignorant of, or even slightly off about, you will either hear about it from YouTube, TikTok, or the mainstream news. That is, if you're seeing any success, or just pissed off the right people. There are people who make good and bad money off of pointing out errors and things other people have gotten wrong, and sometimes what they've gotten right. It is possible to write stories based on places and things you're less than familiar with. Many people do. Some people even do it well and spend a lot of time on research, refinement, and verification. Most people don't have that drive and will stick closer to home. This is fine. There's no quota on how many books have to be set on any one landmass, and honestly, you're allowed to set your book wherever you want, and wherever you think you can tell the best story. But there's one more thing I want to touch on, and I think it hits more on the heart of the question. I'm going to call this section Xenophobia versus Oikophobia. Xenophobia you probably already know. It's the fear of things, people, and places that are different from you. Oikophobia is the exact opposite. It's the fear of things, people, and places that are familiar. I really hate that terms for fear of things has become synonymous with hatred of them. I think doing so muddies the language and is used as a propagandistic tool to disparage people for holding different beliefs or acting outside of what certain groups find acceptable, but that's an argument for a politics channel and not one on books, stories, and other fun things I enjoy. Back to my point. So what do these two overused terms have to do with books and where they're based? If we go back in time to roughly the 90s and early 2000s, a trend started where it was cool to hate on the States. It probably started earlier, but some things I don't want to dig too deep into. It was a fad like any other. Edgy teenagers or adults trying to signal how cool they were would claim to hate the States and wear that same sullen look that all teenagers wear when they're bored with a world they know almost nothing about. I remember a band named Green Day even wrote and produced what, if I can remember correctly, was a whole album called American Idiot. I honestly preferred the Weird Al parody myself. There were a lot of reasons for this, but even as a high school kid, I remember seeing this in my fellows and having trouble believing them. There were also a lot of reasons why people would act like this, and I'm not going into the socio-political events of the time. It's sufficient to say a lot of Americans were following a trend of putting the Canadian flag on their luggage when they were abroad. Over the decades, things have changed and things have stayed the same. Without getting too into the weeds, an attitude was refined from old behaviors that I think most people who have it aren't entirely aware they have it. It's the attitude of treating America like your embarrassing father. Like, the most boring place a story can be set is in the States. On the one hand, this could be due to a bit of burnout, as usually when a story is set in the US, it's usually set in the same few locations. Those being locations most tourists would be familiar with. But that's a common complaint of all natives of all countries. But modern America has a more homogeneous culture than years past. Most people eat at the same restaurants and shop at the same stores regardless of where in the States they live. Corporatism has erased a lot of the unique cultures and traditions of the areas they plant their giant square temples, and television took out what remained. There is some good and some bad with this, but it has the unfortunate side effect of making every place from sea to shining sea feel very familiar. There is a strange fascination with places like Europe with so many different groups of people and cultures all crammed together across a continental landmass. Europe has 44 countries in it, whereas North America only has 23. And only 3 of which I bet most people watching this video can name. Don't feel bad, I thought it was 4. All that said, there is definitely an aversion in some groups for stories set in the United States. I think a lot of this is because we're in that weird stage of civilization where everyone is writing a book. With everyone writing a book, the markets are a little bit flooded. This isn't helped by the AI bros trying to make a quick buck, pumping out mass-produced, barely read pap, and using dubious legal tactics to make a quick buck. Most of these books will be set in the US because of the reasons listed above, and in the case of the AI bros, because it's easier. Add to this the almost hipsterish dismissal of things unironically set in the United States. There's an eagerness to use this setting as if it's a negative. It's to a point that it's actually affecting culture. By the same token, there's a bit of xenophilia and oikophilia in modern culture as well. A lot of people and companies will promote something just because it's different regardless of if it's good or not. I'm not going to be naming names, but as the perpetual centrist might say, it's the fault of both sides. And they wouldn't be entirely wrong. Someone on one side will make a book and brag about how they set it in or out of the States and with or without a certain group of people in it. Then the other side squeals, and videos are made, articles are written, and inevitably, the other side does exactly the same thing to own the other side. Then you get the commercials. We need to defeat X, so buy my new song, book, film that promotes Y values. This is just the times we live in. So what can be done about this? Well, a better question is, why should we do anything about it? We're all entitled to our eccentricities, and honestly, it pays to have something for those with, let's say, their drive outshines their talent or desire for improvement to focus on. Also, sometimes something really funny comes out of it, and not just something annoying and ham-fisted. That said, if you feel attacked by this, don't be. We all get drawn into things from time to time. We all have blind spots, desperately held beliefs, and attitudes we've developed over a lifetime we may or may not be aware of. It's one of the things that can make stories fun. Alright, pointless rant over. Good luck, everyone.